Yes, sir. Acknowledged.
Yes, sir. Acknowledged.
Waiting order. Acknowledged.
Yes, sir. Affirmative. Yes, sir. At once. Yes, sir. Agreed. Reporting. Affirmative. Ready and waiting. Agreed. Vehicle report. Affirmative. Affirmative. Affirmative.
Yes, sir.
Acknowledged.
Yes, sir. Acknowledged. Waiting order.
Yes, sir. Acknowledged. Report knowledge. Awaiting orders.
Yes, sir.
Affirmative.
Comrade.
Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative.
Waiting order.
Acknowledged. Yes, sir. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Vehicle reporting. Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. 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 Awaiting orders.
Acknowledged. Yes, sir. Affirmative. 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 Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Yes, sir.
Acknowledged. Yes, sir. Affirmative. 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 Acknowledged.
Yes, sir. Acknowledged.
Yes, sir. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged.
Waiting order.
Affirmative. Reporting. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Awaiting orders.
Affirmative.
Vehicle reporting.
Affirmative. Acknowledge. Affirmative. Acknowledge. 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 Acknowledge.
Reporting.
Affirmative.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Affirmative. Yes, sir.
Acknowledge.
Yes, sir.
Acknowledge. 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 Affirmative. Acknowledge. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledge. Affirmative. Acknowledge. Reporting. Yes, sir.
Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged.
Waiting order. Affirmative. Yes, sir.
Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged.
Reporting. Acknowledged. Affirmative.
Reporting.
Yes, sir.
Affirmative. Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Yes, sir. Acknowledged. Vehicle reporting. Affirmative.
Reporting. Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Affirmative. 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 Acknowledged. Comrade. Reporting.
Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. 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 Awaiting orders. Affirmative. Yes, sir. Affirmative.
Yes, sir. Acknowledged. Yes, sir. Acknowledged.
Yes, sir. Affirmative. Affirmative.
Waiting. Affirmative.
Yes, sir.
Acknowledged.
Yes, sir. Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Affirmative. 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 Affirmative.
Yes, sir. Affirmative.
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
Acknowledged. Affirmative.
Yes, sir. Affirmative.
Vehicle report. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged.
Comrade. Affirmative.
Yes, sir. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged. 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 Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative.
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged. 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 Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Acknowledged.
Yes, sir.
Affirmative.
Waiting order. Acknowledged.
Yes, sir. Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Vehicle report. Affirmative.
Yes, sir. Affirmative. Yes, sir. Acknowledged.
Awaiting orders.
Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Yes, sir.
Acknowledged.
Yes, sir. Affirmative.
Acknowledged. Yes, sir.
Very well. Reporting. Yes, sir. Acknowledged. Yes, sir.
Affirmative. Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. 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 Acknowledged. Affirmative. Affirmative.
Waiting order. Acknowledged. 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 Yes, sir.
Yes, sir. Affirmative.
Comrade.
Affirmative. Acknowledged. Yes, sir. Affirmative. Yes, sir. Affirmative. Reporting. Awaiting orders.
Affirmative. 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 Acknowledged. 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 Affirmative. 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 Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Affirmative.
Yes, sir. At once. Agreed. Affirmative.
Yes, sir.
Acknowledged. Affirmative. Yes, sir. Affirmative.
Yes, sir. Reporting.
Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. 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 Yes, sir. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Reporting. At once. Very well. Yes, sir. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Affirmative. Yes, sir. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Affirmative. Reporting. Affirmative. Yes, sir. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Yes, sir. Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Vehicle reporting. Affirmative. Reporting. Agreed. Vehicle report. Affirmative. Yes, sir. Acknowledged.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Acknowledged. Acknowledged.
Awaiting orders.
Waiting order. Affirmative.
Reporting.
Acknowledged. Yes, sir. Affirmative. Comrade.
At once.
Reporting. Affirmative. Yes, sir.
At once. Very well. Yes, sir. Acknowledged.
Comrade. Acknowledged.
Vehicle reporting. Affirmative.
Waiting order. Waiting order. Yes, sir. Affirmative. Yes, sir. Affirmative.
Ready and very well. Awaiting orders.
Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Comrade.
Affirmative.
Yes, sir.
Acknowledged.
Yes, sir. Waiting.
Affirmative.
Unit lost. Unit lost.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Waiting order.
Unit
Yes, sir.
lost.
Report acknowledged. Yes, sir.
Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. 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 Affirmative. 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 Acknowledged. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. 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 Affirmative. Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Affirmative. 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 Acknowledged. Yes, sir.
Affirmative.
Reporting.
Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Very well.
Yes, sir.
Vehicle affirmative.
Unit
Vehicle
lost.
reporting. Acknowledged. Yes, sir. Affirmative. Yes, sir. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Affirmative.
Yes, sir.
Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Vehicle report. Acknowledged. Yes, sir.
Acknowledged. Affirmative.
Yes, sir. Affirmative. Yes, sir. Affirmative.
Yes, sir.
Affirmative.
Yes, sir.
Affirmative. Affirmative.
40
Acknowledged.
minutes remaining.
Awaiting orders.
Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged.
Awaiting orders. Affirmative. 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 Affirmative.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Acknowledged. Acknowledged.
Vehicle reporting.
Affirmative. Acknowledged.
Yes, sir.
Affirmative. Yes, sir. Affirmative. Affirmative.
Acknowledged. Affirmative. Awaiting orders. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Yes, sir. Acknowledged.
Comrade. Affirmative. Affirmative.
Awaiting orders. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Affirmative.
Yes, sir. Affirmative.
Yes, sir.
Acknowledged. Affirmative.
Vehicle reporting. Affirmative. Awaiting orders. Affirmative. Vehicle report. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Yes, sir. Affirmative. Affirmative. Reporting. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Yes, sir.
Affirmative. Affirmative.
Yes, sir. Acknowledged. Awaiting orders.
Affirmative. Comrade. Affirmative. Waiting order.
Acknowledged. Yes, sir. Acknowledged. Acknowledged.
Waiting order. Acknowledged.
Yes, sir. Acknowledged. Yes, sir.
Acknowledged.
Awaiting orders. Acknowledged.
Comrade. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Reporting.
Acknowledged. Awaiting orders. Acknowledged. Awaiting orders. Acknowledged. Vehicle reporting. Acknowledged. Yes, sir. Affirmative. Reporting. Affirmative. Yes, sir. Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative.
Yes, sir.
Affirmative. Acknowledged.
Yes, sir.
Affirmative. Acknowledged. 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 Affirmative. Yes, sir.
Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged.
Yes, sir.
Affirmative. Affirmative. Yes, sir. Reporting.
Affirmative.
Reporting.
Affirmative. 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 Acknowledge. 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 Affirmative. Acknowledge. Acknowledge. Affirmative. Acknowledge. Affirmative.
Yes, sir. Acknowledged.
Yes, sir. Acknowledge. Yes, sir.
Affirmative. Waiting order. Comrade. Acknowledged.
Reporting. Affirmative.
Waiting order. Affirmative. Waiting order.
Affirmative. Affirmative. Awaiting orders.
Yes, sir. Affirmative. Yes, sir. Acknowledged.
Yes, sir. Acknowledge. Yes, sir. Acknowledge. Reporting. Affirmative.
Reporting. Affirmative. Comrade.
Acknowledge. Report. Affirmative. Reporting. Acknowledge. Affirmative. Acknowledge. Acknowledge. Affirmative. Acknowledge. Affirmative. Acknowledge.
Reporting.
Acknowledge. Affirmative. Yes, sir.
Affirmative. Waiting order.
Acknowledge. Affirmative. Yes, sir.
Acknowledged. Affirmative. 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 Comrade. Acknowledged.
Yes, sir.
Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged.
Yes, sir.
Acknowledged. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged. 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 Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Affirmative. Yes, sir. Acknowledged. Waiting order.
Acknowledge. Reporting.
Waiting order. Reporting. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Yes, sir. Reporting. Affirmative. Yes, sir. Acknowledged.
Awaiting orders.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Acknowledged. Yes, sir.
Acknowledge. Affirmative. 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 Acknowledge. 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 Affirmative. Acknowledge. Affirmative. Acknowledge. Affirmative. Acknowledge. 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 Affirmative. Acknowledge.
30
Acknowledge.
minutes remaining.
Yes, sir. Affirmative. Affirmative.
Yes, Yes, sir. Affirmative.
Yes, sir.
Awaiting orders. Affirmative.
Yes, sir.
Acknowledged. Vehicle report. Affirmative.
Comrade.
Vehicle report. Affirmative. Acknowledged.
Yes, sir. Acknowledged.
Yes, sir. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Affirmative.
Yes, sir. Affirmative.
Reporting. Acknowledged.
Reporting. Yes, sir.
Unit
Acknowledged.
lost.
Yes, sir. Affirmative. Yes, sir. Reporting.
Reporting. At once. Agreed. Affirmative. At once. At once. Affirmative. Very well. Affirmative. At once. At once.
Yes, sir. Affirmative. 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 Acknowledge. Affirmative. Affirmative.
Unit lost.
Acknowledge. Acknowledge. Affirmative.
Yes, sir.
Unit
Very well.
lost.
Comrade. Affirmative. Yes, sir. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Waiting order. Affirmative.
Vehicle report. Affirmative. Yes, sir. Affirmative. Vehicle report. Affirmative. Yes, sir.
Spy plane ready. Select target. Select target.
Yes, sir.
Comrade. Affirmative.
Awaiting orders.
Affirmative. Affirmative. Reporting. Affirmative.
Yes, sir. Acknowledged. Acknowledged.
Waiting order.
Reporting. Affirmative. Affirmative. Vehicle reporting.
Comrade.
Acknowledged. Reporting. Affirmative.
Reporting. Waiting order.
Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Acknowledged.
Unit
Acknowledged.
lost.
Agreed. Agreed. Affirmative. At once. At once. Yes, sir. Affirmative. 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 At once. Yes, sir.
Affirmative. Yes, sir.
Affirmative.
Report. Acknowledged. Comrade.
Awaiting. At once. Very well. Vehicle reporting.
Affirmative.
Yes, sir. At once. Awaiting orders. Affirmative. Yes, sir. Affirmative. Ready and affirmative. Very well. Agreed. Affirmative. Agreed. Report. Affirmative. Acknowledged.
Unit lost.
Affirmative. Acknowledged. Reporting.
Affirmative. Affirmative.
Yes, sir. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. 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 Vehicle reporting.
Comrade. Affirmative.
Yes, sir. Acknowledged. Acknowledged.
Waiting order. Acknowledged.
Acknowledged. Affirmative. Yes, sir. Affirmative. Report. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Ready? Very well. Affirmative.
Unit lost.
Yes, sir. Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Waiting order.
Report. Acknowledged.
Yes, sir. Affirmative.
Reporting.
Yes, sir. Comrade. Affirmative.
Reporting. Acknowledged. Vehicle reporting. Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Acknowledged.
Spy plane
Acknowledged.
ready.
Acknowledged.
Select target.
Yes, sir.
Affirmative.
Vehicle report. Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Yes, sir.
Affirmative.
Yes, sir. Acknowledged. Affirmative.
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir. Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Awaiting orders.
Affirmative. Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged.
Mission accomplished.
sir.